Last video I managed to bolster my Necrons just enough to achieve a humble, but playable 650 point army. And being a man of many stalled projects, the plan for this video was to swoop in, complete another overlooked unit or two, and achieve something similar. But then the impossible happened. I made a new friend. My name's Fraz, and this is still third.
They shall falter, and they shall die.
Jack and I connected after he posted in the 3rd edition Facebook group, welcoming all challengers in
Redacted.
Hey, I like 3rd edition, and I live pretty near.
Redacted.
I suggested a local shop to serve as a battleground, and we settled on 1,000 points for our first engagement. The problems with this were twofold. I hadn't played 40k in 20 years, and I did not have 1,000 points. Looks like Necrodermis is back on the menu, boys. The list was simple. I had my Lord, Warriors, and Wraiths already, so they're in. The new additions would be a squad of Immortals, Destroyers, and a Tomb Spider. Altogether, that's about 1,000 points in 3rd edition money. I picked up and built the Immortals, and the Destroyers, easily enough. But due to a stock issue, the Tomb Spider was delayed. This left me with a very specific points gap in my list, but then I remembered this guy. I picked them up second-hand from a great local shop in town ages ago. I stole his arm for my Wraith conversions, and with such an awkward pose and being a lone trooper, I never really knew what to do with him. But as they say, necessity is the mother of conversion. Heavy destroyers are like destroyers, but they're armed with heavy Gauss cannons. Originally, this was a metal component that you added to your plastic destroyer frame, but to my eye, they always looked a little too unwieldy, and perhaps weren't structurally sound either. So that was the play. I can run a single heavy destroyer without issue, and it will plug that gap nicely. It was time to get creative. The main thing I needed to do was fashion a heavy Gauss cannon, so I turned to the Immortal Sprue. Since you can use this kit to make some newer units, there are a bunch of interesting looking weapons left over. These guns, which I am now discovering are called synaptic disintegrators, looked really promising. I think a high-strength, single-shot weapon could easily be represented by something that looks a little more snipery than the standard Gauss weapons. But the textured barrel, that had to go. I so very poorly liberated it from the rest of the gun, and yes, I bent the plastic something awful, but, it bent back. Since the weapon needed length, I did this twice with a mind to combine both. On the first, I clipped away the end of the gun and tidied that piece up with a knife and sanding stick. I then clipped, clawed, and carved away the Necron hand clinging to the bottom. Again, this needed some thorough cleaning up afterwards. Following a quick comparison, you can probably start to see what I'm going for here. I chopped the other piece in half and tried for another dry fit. I think it's important to do this throughout a build to make sure you're on track. I then hacked this hand off too. To remain distinct from the regular Gauss cannon and recognisable enough as the weapon it was intended to be, the gun needed to be longer, which thankfully, it was. After clipping away the tube and the entire stock, we were left with the important bits. Now, despite them being plastic, to secure two such long, narrow pieces end to end, I decided to use pinning. This process starts by using the tip of a knife to add some guide holes before drilling each. I tried as best I could to get these as central as possible for good alignment. I then grabbed some thin wire, glue in one end, trim it to size, and attach the other piece. This wasn't the snuggest fit, so I had to make sure everything was straight before I stopped manipulating the pieces and let them dry. Now, to be in keeping with the destroyers of old, we needed some classic plain tubes. Fortunately, I had just the right size styrene rod. I cut this a little too big so I can file it to fit. I do the cuts by rolling the piece with my knife. I find that using clippers pinches the rod and can deform it. This might not be super straight, but that is easy to fix. I do this twice, use some Tamiya extra thin to bond them, and there we go. I was considering reposing the arm. Removing it from the body would make that, and attaching the new gun, possible. The downside is that it's been put together with poly cement, so is entirely bonded. It just won't snap off. In the end, I grabbed my clippers and did my worst. It's nothing we couldn't fix in post, probably. With the arm then free, I cut away the Gauss cannon and made good the edges. My newfangled gun didn't quite fit in the depression available, so some further carving was required. After a time, I landed on a fit I was happy with, and once again, knowing how easily the traditional heavy Gauss blasters fell apart, I decided to pin mine to keep everything nice and durable. And there it was. Back to this vestigial nubbin. Something had to be done. No knife or clippers were getting in there, so I turned to my rotary tool. I had the same issue from the other socket from when I stole his other arm, so that got a good excavating too. I needed a new ball joint to connect to the torso. I had no shortage of Necron arms, so I pinched one, cleaned it up, and you guessed it, pinned it on. After another quick dry fit, it looks okay. The new joint was a bit gappy where it connected to the arm, and we'd lost a little bit of the distinctive shape, so I sculpted back in some form with Milliput. This can easily be sanded when dry, so I didn't feel as though it needed to be as exact. Lastly, there were these vacant ports that once had some kind of tube attached. I figured I could add something in here to further connect these two bits. I drilled a hole in each port so I could attach some wire. I used some pliers to bend it into shape, and there it was, another miscellaneous power tube. Now, the missing arm. I had an idea for this, and I knew there was a risk it was going to look a little goofy, but my hands felt pretty tired, so I decided to give it a go. Heavy destroyers have this additional aiming apparatus grafted to their spines that curves over their shoulder. This is a feature my heavy destroyer doesn't have, so I figured since I had a natural gap in the sculpt, why don't I recreate this scope, but as an arm instead? To achieve the ribbed, articulated look of the original, I immediately thought I'd thread some wire through beads. Maybe this could have worked, but the beads were a little too irregular for a Necron, and perhaps also a little chunky. Instead, I devised a new design. The upper arm would be as standard. I grabbed another spare arm and cut it down to size. The articulated scope would instead start at the elbow. There was an aesthetic precedent for this since one of my wraiths has a really similar thing going on. Once it was cleaned up, I added some wire to help attach the next part. To achieve something more delicate than craft beads, I turned to green stuff. I have these tube/tentacle rollers that were perfect for the job. Using plenty of water to avoid the putty sticking, I rolled out what I needed. I then used the flat reverse of the plastic to round out the segments to get an overall shape I was happy with. Off camera, I manipulated the piece into a curve and set it to one side to cure, with some paint pots holding it in place. It left me with this. I sized it up and cut away the excess. For a more secure bond, I then, say it with me now, pinned the pieces together. I grabbed a sharp tool and pressed a hole into the tube before adding some superglue and really pressing the parts together. Following this, I cut some more styrene rod and attached it to the end to serve as the scope, before cutting it to size. Lastly, a quick sanding of the weapon arm and everything was glued into place. In and around this, I do my best to file and clean up the model at large before moving on to painting. Now this, we can blitz through. As is the standard for my Necrons, we have a good spray of lead belcher, followed up by a generous Basilicanum grey wash and a dry brushing of Vallejo Air Silver, Vallejo Blue Green, White Grey, and Citadel Moot Green. The eye plate and gun are Vallejo German Grey, whereas the secondary metal is Brassy Brass. I wash those parts with Guilliman Flesh before hitting the pipes and cavities with Black Templar Contrast. I also use my Vallejo Blue-Grey wash on the face. The weapon casing is dry brushed with a mix of this blue-grey and German grey, before a lighter brushing of pure blue-grey. To give the barest hint of variation and shading to the blue, I glaze Vallejo Dark Sea Blue towards the bottom of the panels. I then begin blending the greens. Towards the edges I glaze in Warpstone Glow, towards the centre I use Vallejo Yellow Green. I come in and dot the eyes with Moot Green and Yellow Green too. Now, to quickly highlight and add battle damage to the blue panels, I use a torn piece of sponge and some Baharoth Blue. I then mix in more and more white grey as I push and reinforce the edge highlights with a brush. I highlight the brass with a mix of Brassy Brass and Vallejo Air Silver, a light dry brush. Lastly, I wash a little Drakenhof Nightshade around the chest emblem for contrast, before carefully picking it out with Brassy Brass. You know what? I think my Heavy Destroyer turned out really well. Putting this guy together during spare evenings against the clock presented a unique challenge. I had to get creative with the bits I had available whilst keeping my ambition in check, since I needed to finish the build before my game. I think my heavy Gauss cannon retains enough of the lance-like shape of the original to be recognisable, but it adds a precision, sharpshooter flavour. Have you guys ever had to kit bash something together in a pinch for a game? Let me know in the comments. Now the rest of the army, that didn't quite get over the line. In fact, both Jack and I ran forces that were a little work in progress around the edges, and that was fine. We had an amazing game that involved us spending as much time looking things up as we were rolling dice. I really wish I had more pictures for you, but we were so wrapped up in it, we didn't really take any. Though his boys in blue bested mine this time around, we're scheduled to have another game soon. We'll be back. Next up, watch this space. I have loads of ideas for further conversions and small army projects that need attention. It'll be nice to take a step away from... Oh,